We recognize that this is the last session, that you've had a ton of content so far, and we're going to light things up a little bit. My name is Deno Himonas. I have been with Wilson for all of 2.5 months. Yeah, I'm a veteran. Prior to that, I was on the Utah Supreme Court for 7 years. I was a trial court judge for 11 years. And before that, I was a lawyer doing complex civil litigation for 15 years. So I'm back at it in the private sector. And this being last is kind of a metaphor for when you want to see me in your company's life cycle. Either never, but certainly not at the beginning, right? So just quickly about the litigation department. My philosophy for my entire 30-something years in the law has been take care of your clients and your clients will take care of you. It's that simple. I love the notion of beginning with startups, taking them through the beginning, launching them, watching them become successful, and then working through that with them in all aspects as they grow into mature companies. I've done my job if I can help you ensure that you've never been sued. Right? That's the best thing that I can do. Get involved in potential disputes early on, bring a little, maybe some of the gray hairs in my beard to the table, and help you resolve those. And as a firm, that's the approach. And it makes sense, right? This is a company-driven law firm. We succeed, we flourish when our clients flourish. Now, at the end of the day, some of you are going to be involved in litigation, and that's the unfortunate reality. And at that point, then we play a different role. It's hopefully, expert advice, expert advocacy, all done with professionalism and integrity. All right. In terms of what we're going to do today, we thought that we would role play a little bit. Let's give you a Harvard Business Review case scenario for founders' disputes. But before I do that, I need to shut up and let you introduce yourself.
Well, you've seen Alison all day, which you are all so lucky that we've had the pleasure of being able to have Wilson Sonsini here with us at BU. So thank you to the Pivot Center. Thank you to our friends at Wilson Sonsini for spending the day with us. This has been so helpful. We're so fortunate to have such a wonderful research institution here at BU, such fantastic researchers, entrepreneurs, the Pivot Center that brings everyone together, and then firms like Wilson that can come and share their expertise and lend their knowledge and partners to give us days like today. So I've been taking notes all day. I look forward to learning from all of you. So my name is Katelin Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of BioHive. So BioHive is the kind of sister organization to BioUtah, which is the trade organization for life sciences in the state. So what's BioHive? So BioHive is the face of the cluster of the industry. So what are these 1,300 companies in life sciences and healthcare innovation doing in the state, you might ask, because some of you might want to be entrepreneurs. So they are pioneering innovation for humanity, as we like to say. Now, I don't think that that's bold enough, because the companies in Utah are making life-saving devices, therapeutics, diagnostics, and IT infrastructure that goes into our hospitals and healthcare systems. So we try to get those stories out into the public, which helps raise capital, helps entrepreneurs build up their profile, recruit talent, which are some of the topics we're going to discuss today, and bring those founders together in some cases, because we are also a convening force bringing people together, which is why we're one of the partners today. So without further ado, I think we should jump into it. I'm really excited to tell you about the company that we are forming. Should we tell them about our new enterprise?
They haven't signed non-disclosure agreements, but I think we ought to go ahead and tell them. KD&A Vintage Communion Wines. I've done a lot of market research, and I know you will not find vintage communion wines on site. You'll find vintage communion vessels. You'll find vintage wine But we thought, we're going to marry them, and we have this brilliant idea of vintage communion wines. Now listen, I want a big part of this company because, I am the finest consumer of vintage communion wines amongst this.
But I ensured that we could secure our supply chain resource, and I actually bought a vineyard in Greece. So we can get the wine secured. We don't have to go to another source. So I think I should get a bigger portion of the company.
Whoa. Let's be honest, guys. You came up with the name. You are a trust fund, baby. And so your family gave you your money. I'm the one that's gonna do all the work. You know it. You know I'm gonna be the one doing all the work. And so you guys have already made it. You're wealthy. I need a bigger stake because I have my family's legacy on this, and
You're gonna crush.
I'm putting
crush
in
grapes.
all the work. So
Alison, walk the fine people. Like how do you work through a dispute like this, which happens often with founders?
Yeah, in fact, looking this morning at the Harvard Business Review, I noted that the largest cause of startup failure, founder disputes, right? And it's resolving these issues early is key.
yeah, and the largest cause of failing to even get a startup off the ground is founder disputes. How do you have a productive dialogue with people when everybody has different interests, everybody wants ownership, and everybody wants to be treated fairly and valued for what they're contributing? I think that the biggest way to walk through it is oftentimes there is one leading founder or a pair of people, and they need to have an honest and thoughtful discussion about what they are contributing. Oftentimes, when you leave to go work for a startup, you're leaving a very secure job, and you're taking a risk to do that. What we see is people's risk tolerance is different. Sometimes one person will jump off and go all in, quit the job, live on ramen noodles, and go all in, while the other co-founder has a lower risk tolerance and says, I'm going to keep working, but I'm going to contribute on nights and weekends and pull my card on the nights and weekends. Inevitably, the person who left, who has no income coming in, tends to be the one that goes all in on the deal, and the person who is working part-time, just when they had time available, is the person that isn't contributing much. So the first step you have to do when you come to the table with what are you contributing is what are the expectations that each of you has for the role that the other person is going to serve. If it's a straight 50-50 split, it should be a straight 50-50 split in terms of contributions to the company, in terms of commitment to the company. If you're both going to pony up some money to the company, I really think you have to have those conversations and set those expectations. And be okay if you're the guy that doesn't want to leave your full-time job and you just want to be partially committed, you're going to get partial equity. And that's the right thing to do. We often have clients come to us to form a company, very excited. Inevitably, the biggest piece is this equity discussion and who gets a piece of the pie. And what I like to tell people is you want to negotiate your divorce, in this case, before you get married, before you form the company. And that's a really important thing to do.
I have taken the position from the beginning of my practice and told my clients, you ought not go into business with someone unless you'd be willing to do it on a handshake. You should never do it on a handshake, to be clear. You should make sure you have written down and have clear expectations and papered it correctly. But I think it's really important that when you're thinking about your co-founders, that you have some synchronicity. You have a shared vision. You have a shared work ethic. You have a shared sense of values. Trust. Right? You really are willing to work with one another and work things out. I also, and I'm stealing this from Chad, from this morning. Chad is forming a new company, and with his co-founder, he said they put one rule in place. And I think that, I mean, this is real world this morning. Before Chad knew what we were doing, he said, no asses. That's it, right?
Almost.
Well, I tried to clean up the language a little bit for the audience. But
Yeah.
You take the kid out of New York. You can't take the New York out of the kid.
That's right. Looks like you have a question.
Yeah, how do you navigate, what are some examples of navigators where one person has the idea and they bring a couple other, they get two other founders inspired, and they're all contributing equivalently to the production. But somebody really started with the idea and got the other one or two founders inspired to join. So how do you navigate equity discussions around that? I mean, obviously there's a whole spectrum, but if you have some examples or some discussions.
Yeah, so to repeat the question so that everybody can hear it, what if you have a group of 3 founders or people who are all contributing at an early stage company, but one really brought the secret sauce and the idea. One is really the brains behind it and started the company, but they are all now equally all in. How do you split the equity or have those conversations? As a general matter, what we see is the one with the idea. If there is one person with the idea who's going to go pursue this, they usually form the company. And so they are 100% owner for at least some period of time. And then you have leverage to go make offers to other key players. What I talked about earlier about vesting is really critical. I just had last week a little 2-man company who's in a fintech space. One founder is leaving. They didn't want to agree to vesting terms up front, so he's leaving with he has a 25% stake, and the other founder is saying, how do I get that back? Mm-hmm. And my answer is, you don't. You can offer to buy him out, but you don't have a contractual right to get that back. So if there really is, if you have a group of 3, but there is one guy or gal who really has the idea, I would say, and if that's you, I would say go form your company and then bring the other players along and issue them equity so that you can kind of set the table and say, I'm going to take, and I will give you a real life example. I had a set of 4 women who were going to start a company. They were all following one leader. And she ended up with a 40% stake, and then the remaining 60% was split equally among the other 3 gals. And so you can dictate that a little bit. I don't know if that answers your question. It's complicated, and every circumstance is complicated.
There's no vague answer to it, but it does add some perspective. Thank you.
Yeah.
Isn't it where a slice and pie model comes into play, which is dynamic split of equity between the founders, as opposed to static when you put when you assign the numbers at the get-go, which becomes very unfair very fast. The slice and pie is this dynamic, so there is like a whole formula, like whole science, there's like 1 hour YouTube video on the entire model. Is it something you would endorse? It's called slice and pie model. There is a book about it, there are 3 books about it.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked into that actually. So I don't remember the exact model of how they decide ownership is split. Is it on hours of contribution?
Hours is 1, like sweat equity. Second, money is like 4 times. So your sweat equity is 2x, your money is 4x, and apparently this all plays into like how to split equity at the get-go.
Yeah, so the question was, do I buy into the slicing of the pie model that sounds like it assigns kind of formulaic values to different contributions, sweat equity, money contributions, maybe IP that comes in. I think those things serve as great discussion points and data points. I think you can't get too formulaic about it because people will find a way to work the system. And so it really is about relationships. Like what Deno was saying, it's really about those relationships and having an open and honest conversation about what people really are contributing. And then you always want that vesting of their shares or their equity, whatever type of entity you're in, so that if they leave, you have a mechanism to get it back. Yeah.
Alison, can having quote-unquote dead equity on your cap table impede you from raising money from investors?
It can. It depends on, you know, how much equity there is there. But if you've got a former founder who is no longer with the company but has voting control of the common stock, you are kind of dead in the water because you're not going to be able to do and approve a financing round without their vote. And so you have to be very careful about those circumstances and making sure that along with whatever equity you give, you don't give one person a right to totally stop a company dead in its tracks. I've seen companies where they want unanimous approval for everything because they're just trying to be fair. Those 4 gals I mentioned earlier, that's how their operating agreement's set up. They have to unanimously approve every major company decision. It's only a matter of time, and it usually happens at a time when companies are struggling, where there is a difference of opinion on what direction you should go. And then you're in a stalemate. And then people just get angry, and then people throw their hands up and give up. And that's where companies that had promise die, because it is not worth it to anybody anymore if you can't move forward in any direction because you're at a stalemate.
So Justice, what do you recommend for a trust test? Going to a remote island and doing it out for a few weeks or what?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, right? I mean, it's sitting down and speaking with I mean, spending time with these individuals. I think you probably, with most co-founders, you've had experience. They're not somebody on the other side of the planet that you've never spoken with. You have a good sense of how they work. You've probably worked together. They're friends, right? I mean, in most of these instances, the vast majority of these instances, I would say, right? You have some pretty good relationship with these individuals, but I think you have to have a clear chain of communication. You have to really be willing to talk about it. I mean, I've had one matter in which they were brothers, right? And none of this discussion actually took place. It was paralyzing to the operation going on because they didn't want to have the hard conversations early on in the process. So they ended up having lots of conflict later on in the process.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Something we see often is promises are made but not documented. We touched on that a little bit earlier too. So I would encourage, whether you're the one signing on to be, I'll call it somebody else's co-founder, you're joining a company or joining in an executive role, or whether you are bringing talent in, a lot of times people will make offhanded comments, right? And sometimes they'll even throw it in an offer letter. I'm going to give you 10% of the company. And what happens is that person walks away with that offer letter and they say, I own 10% of the company. But guess what? You don't own 10% of the company until certain actions are taken to actually issue that stock to you. And that's where you end up in Deno's court, right? You have to follow through with your promises, and you have to make sure that things that have been promised to you are followed through on as well, especially in the co-founder kind of equity role, because we see so often promises are made. I'm going to give you 25% of the company. I'm going to give you 5%, but then it's never really documented, and then that's when you end up in litigation.
So kind of the same question back to you, but I just trust, what are the values that you look for, or you would look for in a co-founder?
So I'm a partner at a micro VC fund. I think we definitely try to test founder relationships, how long they've known each other, what their dynamics are. That's very relevant. I think maybe one of the highest things we index on, because, and this has been mentioned multiple times throughout the day, that relationship is going to be very important for the company's success. It's really hard to replace a founder, and can definitely kill a company. And so I think this is very, very important. And sometimes, you'll talk to founders and they're like, yeah, we met in a business school class and it was a great idea and we teamed up because we're just covering each other's blind spots. That's a red flag. I mean, if you're just getting together with someone because you're covering each other's blind spots, and there's not, I think like Deno said, like true value consensus. You've really discussed these deep issues. I think those are the conversations you need to have, because building a company is going to take every bit of you to be successful. I think that CEO panel was really insightful. Those are all really phenomenal CEOs. I know them all a bit personally, and they put every bit of themselves into their company building process. And so pairing up with a co-founder has to be more than just, I have this skill, you have that skill, let's bring it together, and then, we're a whole piece. It definitely needs to be a really thoughtful process about who you are going to be with, and really in depth. Good question?
Yes, so basically all the legal startup package for the startups, they would have founder agreement built in as just a part of the package. It would describe all this vesting, all the terms, and everyone would sign to the percentage, be it static or dynamic, of the shares even again. And I assume that the Wilson Sonsini, the neuron, like portal, would have something similar. Is it true? Is this neuron a version of a startup legal package that would have founder agreement in it? Is it?
Yeah, that's right. So most startups, including Wilson and Neuron, we send a questionnaire, which causes founders to have the conversations, because in that questionnaire you'll fill out who are the equity owners, how much shares do they own, what terms does it vest under. Those are the very basic questions to ask, and that's all part of the startup package and what you find in Neuron. What is uniquely tailored to companies, and some companies start with one and some don't, but if you're going to be a very closely held company and you're like a two-person shop, I would suggest that you have a stockholders agreement that will cover those circumstances of what happens if somebody leaves. Do you have a right to buy back their shares? And at what value? Do you buy it back at what they bought into it, which was pennies on the dollar, or is it at the value when they leave the company? What happens when somebody gets divorced and they don't get a choice in who holds their shares? Half of them go to their spouse. What do you do? Is there anything you can do to protect that? Because maybe you really don't like your co-founder's spouse, and that would be the end of the company when the spouse comes in. In your stockholders agreement, you cover those kinds of scenarios. What happens if somebody dies? What happens if somebody dies? It's the stuff you don't want to have the conversation about. Nobody wants to talk about it. The two brothers don't want to talk about when one of them dies, what happens. But you have to have those conversations and plan for those circumstances and events. And the other thing to think about is what happens when somebody is effectively fired for cause. What happens if one of the co-founders is committing fraud, is convicted of a crime? What happens if one of the co-founders is mentally incompetent, gets really sick? Have you already discussed that and how that's going to play out for the company at the forefront of formation? It makes it, when you approach those events, so much easier because you've already thought about it, talked about it, and formed an agreement on it in each of those circumstances. But it is the conversation, and people don't want to pay legal fees or advisory fees when they form a startup. The last thing they want to be talking about is exit events for their founders and how they're going to address that, because everybody comes in with a positive attitude because they're entrepreneurial and building something really cool. But those are the exact things that absolutely create a company time and time again.
These are hard conversations, and we're human. And we don't like having hard conversations, particularly with friends who are inevitably going to be our co-founders, right? And I guess part of the message here is you really need to be willing to do that. And as you're talking about, the founders, as you're talking about the allocation of founders' shares, or founders' stock, that it's a good opportunity to have that conversation, and it's a must-do.
Yeah, and the other thing I would throw out there is, it's not a one-time conversation. You shouldn't have a conversation about equity just at formation. You should be visiting internally, just like you would with your external board. You should be visiting internally and having open conversations about how is it going. And people don't do that. And what happens is resentment builds up because somebody feels like they're putting in more effort, time, money, resources than the other person. And resentment builds and builds and things will blow up. And so scheduling those periodic conversations now that just say, we're gonna check in and have an honest conversation about, are you contributing what you said you would do? Are you performing in the way that you said you were? What can I do to help you? What can you do to help me? It really is a marriage. It really is having those kinds of conversations that is gonna help you propel forward. Yeah?
So I would hope too that factors into the character of the person or persons that you're going to business with. I mean, for instance, as Deno mentioned earlier, this other person that we were talking about, we're still in the infancy, but we said at the beginning, it's like, look, we're gonna start off 50-50. Let's just say, somebody, he does, more of the work for this, I bring in more of the money, or not as much as, the contribution hasn't been there, so that we will have these regular conversations, going forward. But, so just, we're all grown-ups, and hopefully we can do this, get this hammered out on the front end, so it doesn't become confrontational during the whole process.
Yeah, that's a good plan. You have to just follow through and actually have those conversations, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a way to build a dynamic split of equity? So let's say on set, there are these numbers, but it may change a year later or 4 years later. So is there any way to build it into founder agreement that they're going to be like annual or whatever revisions of the split?
The way to do that, so the question is, can you build in dynamic equity? Can you agree now that there will be certain things that change the equity ownership in the future? My data points there are causing people, moving equity around from one founder to another is oftentimes a taxable event. And so you have to be really careful with how you structure it, because when you're taking value from one founder and you're saying you had 50% of the company yesterday, but something happened and now 25% is going to go to the other founder, a lot of times that transfer will be taxable. So there are things to be very careful of. The probably more advisable way to do it is to do additional equity grants. When you could say when certain milestones are met, and we're talking about founders here, but I think we want to move into executives and key team members too, and so it's kind of a good segue. But you can agree, hey, I'm in charge of sales, and if I meet my stretch sales goal, the company is going to grant me X additional stock, right? And that's the way that it kind of can dynamically shift without causing a taxable event for the other co-founder. And there's definitely a different morale attached to, hey, you're going to have to forfeit shares and give them to me, or forfeit equity and give them to me, versus, hey, company's going to issue new equity to me, so it's a bonus award to me. So I think that hits differently emotionally.
But new equity comes with option pool, correct?
It can come from the option pool. You can also just issue straight stock. You have to meet certain criteria. If you're an executive of the company, you will likely meet that criteria.
One of the things that we heard earlier from the entrepreneurs that were seated here is that a bad hire in a startup is also deadly. And let's visit for just a few minutes about how you might go about avoiding that bad hire, to ensure that doesn't happen. You're not going to be 100% with it. I don't agree with the notion that if you're batting 500, you're doing okay. I think that would be a disaster. But you are going to have those instances where you've made bad hiring decisions. But how can we, Katelin, how do we do our best to make sure that we avoid that situation?
Well, I really liked what Miles said about culture. I think that's been echoed by a lot of our CEOs throughout the state. Knowing your culture, knowing what you're hiring for, indexing high for those skills, knowing kind of the environment in which you operate. And I think people, there was a great panel with Heather Kirkby from Recursion, and not speaking to culture in terms of kind of your office environment, but more of like your company values and the skills that you're looking for and kind of vision of where you're headed. So I love that she translated that more for things that you can index for in the job. I thought that was kind of insightful to put it into practical terms of what you can look for in an employee. But Alison, talk us through maybe some things you absolutely should not do.
Yeah, so we have a fair amount of war stories. I think, the first thing is legal compliance and hiring. When you're interviewing people, you need to know what questions are very off limits. And I'm a chatty person, as you might be able to tell, so I even have to be very mindful of this when I talk to attorney candidates who we are hiring. I always want to know about people's family status, and do they have kids, and are they married, because that seems like human nature, right? Those are the questions. That's my way of developing a rapport with people. But you don't want to ask about family status. You don't want to ask about marital status. You don't want to ask somebody if they're pregnant, because you are opening yourself up to legal liability if you do. And so a lot of employers are developing scripts, which sounds very, I don't know, less personal. But it's you can still have a personal conversation, but having scripts and having reminders, and also knowing who on your team are the right people to interview. You don't want to go let the guy who's the boisterous, wonderful guy in the office, but the total loose cannon who tells dirty jokes. You don't want to go have him be the one who's doing your interviewing. So be selective about who you interview, or who are the interviewers, and make sure that everybody on your team knows what questions are off limits, and what questions are you're able to ask. I was telling Katelin, I hired 4 females in a row, all of whom were pregnant at the time of hire, which was a great surprise, and we were happy to have them. And I suspected, but you can't ask it, and it can influence your decision, and you don't want to have any facts out there that could imply that one of those factors, a discriminatory factor, influenced your hiring decision, either good or bad.
Yeah, I want to echo that for just a second in 2 ways. One is, do know the laws in which you're operating. A lot of these laws are state-driven or even city-driven, so it may depend on where you're setting up, right? You may have kind of ban-the-box legislation in some locales, and it's going to vary. Think about that beforehand as you conduct your background work, as you think about who you're going to interview, how you're going to conduct the interviews. And second, I really want to double down on the notion of scripting it. And I don't mean by that you stick to the script, you don't ask any other question. But I think it's really important that you're giving your candidates the same opportunity to answer the same questions as you're trying to evaluate them. For me, as I was doing it, the other thing it really made me do is focus on the job-related questions and avoid those that are going to get me into trouble, right? And just that disciplinary process, mental disciplinary process of having to write them down was excellent. Now, look, you're going to rip off the questions as you go back and forth. You're going to want to develop a rapport and test the person out. But I think if you've gone through that process, you'll know where the lines are much more readily.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you can still make it individual while having a script, but I think you added some color there. I'd love for both of you to give some insight on, because I think Wilson is a very entrepreneurial firm. Maybe you can speak to that. I mean, you've both worked in different firms, but what do you look for in hiring, or how do you look at the process of hiring, and what's your experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't legal advice. This is just practical advice to trust your gut, and to not try to fit somebody into a box necessarily, to force something that doesn't feel right to you. Especially when you're an early stage company, everybody wears a lot of hats. You spend a lot of time with these people, more time than you spend with your family or anybody else in your life. So you don't want to force a hire that something in your gut is telling you is not the right hire. I had this happen with a client recently. They really needed a controller. They weren't getting great candidates, but they got one, and it was on a recommendation of another, of a board member. And they interviewed this person and decided to make an offer. But they weren't totally thrilled about it, but they trusted the board member. But come to find out, board member and employee were having an affair. And so trust your gut. I mean, you have board members, and we've talked all day long about how you got to get the right board members on your company, but ultimately it's your company. Ultimately, you as executives in these companies are responsible for protecting the company culture and defining what that is and adding people to it that feel like they are going to help promote that. And so I would say, trust your gut first of all. And then test skills too. I think it's very, especially for technical positions, doing technical interviews, I think proves a lot, because I think we all, or a lot of us, I do, tend to have a bias towards extroverts. They're not always the best workers. So do some skills-based testing, do some technical interviews to try to really assess what people's skill sets are and how capable they are to fulfill the particular job that you have a need for.
I put less value in interviews than virtually any other aspect of the employment process. And maybe I'm a little heretical about that, but I think they're highly artificial. And absent a technical interview where you're handing out assignments that you can objectively judge, I've become really skeptical of those. I've become a real believer in doing the work. I mean, you do the interviews, you look at the resumes, you've done that, but before that decision is made, I have done, within the boundaries of the law, absolutely, I've done the deep dive. And it goes back to having the hard conversations we talked about with founders. We don't like to have the hard conversations when we're doing the follow-ups, as we're calling the references, or doing off-resume reference checks. It's uncomfortable a little bit, so we call it, we're almost looking for kind of a positive response. And I have come to the belief that that's not a best practice, and really do the work. Because somebody can, I think, mask an issue during an interview, but they've not been able to mask it for a year or two or whatever it is with prior employers. You might look into the company, who else you might know that's had a relationship with the individual. So again, I want to emphasize, you got to make sure that you're dealing with all the privacy and other issues, and you're dealing with those correctly, right? But within the bounds of what you're allowed to do, I want to really know what others that have a deep experience with this individual can tell me.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, that's kind of what you need to do anyway, but in today's world, you get about 15 minutes to make an offer. The way it's been out there now, if you don't make an offer when you find somebody that you've interviewed, you think they're okay, by the time you get all that reference information, they're gone. They're somewhere else.
This is true.
So I think you really kind of got to go with your gut a little bit and put them in front of you, like you said. If you've got somebody that's technical, give them some, hey, you had this problem before, or, let's say somebody came to you that said they had an issue with you at work. How'd you handle that? You're really stuck with that hour you have with them or 2 hours you have with them that day.
Yeah. And here, it's a perfect segue into what I was going to address next is you're not going to get the interview right all the time. Even most of the time, you're going to hire people, and you've got to make a quick assessment. Whether, if you're noticing deficiencies early with this person where they are not capable of performing or are not showing that they're capable, you have to make an assessment really fast to, is this person coachable and how can I help coach them, or are they not? And here's the thing, you want to try to coach everybody for a couple reasons, because I believe everybody is deserving of a chance, and because the labor market's tight, and because you want to create a record for legal purposes that you gave performance appraisals, you gave an improvement plan, you worked with this individual, and they didn't work out. which protects you from a liability standpoint if they're an older worker, over 40, if they're a minority, a racial minority, or any of those classes of protected classes. So you want to do that, but I do think because you have to make quick hiring decisions in this labor market, you also have to make quick firing decisions because the longer it lingers, the more difficult it can become, and it can bleed toxicity into other employees who then leave.
That's a bad apple in the group.
Yeah.
You want to get them moved out or put them under new management if it helps.
Yeah.
The PIP is always a good way to go.
But you certainly want to do it carefully.
Yeah.
And so every time folks are looking to make a termination, we usually have like a 15-minute consult to say how to properly do it and not expose yourself to
There was a
liability.
question over there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, do you have a go-to question to kind of fish out that response that might not be 100% positive when you're talking to a reference?
No, I mean, I don't have like a single go-to question, but I think you have to, you get into the conversation and you've got their resume and background, what kind of work did they do, and this is what I've heard, and can you help me understand why there might be a break there? I think it's driven factually by what you know about the person and the position. I did have some, I mean, it was kind of related, some go-to ways of teasing out whether the person really does have the skills, aside from, in my case, particularly when I was in the court, it was all about writing, right? And everybody can tell me they love to write and they can give me a writing sample and what have you. But what I learned early on is to test that by seeing, what else do they do? And do you journal? What other kinds of, I test ways that they showed dedication to the craft without directly asking about it. But again, it's, those are pretty factually unique circumstances.
Well, there's also the interviewing is a two-way street. You're interviewing them, but they're also interviewing you,
Good point.
Especially, for the last couple of years,
Yeah.
I choose my own boss because I know that my direct report, who I have to report me, affects how I perform. And if there's no, we don't get along, I'm not gonna be able to perform well if I don't have if I can't communicate or well like that. So in today's, coming from a teaching my students to learn how to interview their bosses as well. And then in a startup, you don't have a lot to play with. So it's got to be a really good dialogue. I like how you brought that up. You've got to get that dialogue going first because they're also interviewing you.
Great point.
Here's the question that I bring up for references. I ask them, what am I going to find out about this person in 6 months that I'm not going to find out in the first 2 to 4 weeks?
Oh, I like that. Could we?
Because that forces the reference to actually think about it, and really it evokes an honest answer. Because everybody's got that thing that comes out after 6 months. There's something about everybody does, right? So it's like that's what I want. I want to know that thing that I'm not going to figure out in the first 2 to 4 weeks. And that reference knows that even if it's a positive reference, that reference knows the thing that's going to come out. I like that. Right?
Yeah. Can we just steal that without giving you attribution?
Go for it.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I actually have to do I'm somebody's reference in my first one anyway. But aren't there things that you can't say as a reference? Like, can you not say negative things about somebody?
So yeah, and I was actually thinking this because a lot of times law firms, the question is, if I am somebody's reference, are there things I can't say? And it's good to know when people are calling on you on a reference that you can't say. So like, for instance, law firms typically, when they are asked to provide a reference, will verify your dates of employment, period. Because they're risk averse, right? We're risk averse. And what you have to be careful of is that you don't defame somebody, you don't make untrue statements. But those areas, so if you're gonna get, I think you should absolutely be honest, but there are limits, and know who you're dealing with too. If this is somebody who is kind of what we call a litigious personality, somebody who thinks everybody in the world's after them, I'm fairly measured and guarded with my words. But mostly people list references that are going to provide generally positive referrals and information to future employers. And so even when you're calling on those references, you have to also take them with a grain of salt, because nobody's going to list the coworker that they had a role with, you know.
Just for a real world example, another thing you have to look out for is the contract. You may have an agreement in place that requires the employer to only give kind of name, rank, and serial number responses. In one case, that told me everything I needed to know.
Meaning if there was like a settlement agreement, if this person left on bad terms and there's a settlement agreement that says, I will not disparage you or make any negative statements, then you're going to get a response that is like that.
Exactly. It was just that. It was, so what can you tell me? Name, rank, and serial number. And this was somebody that I was close to, so was not expecting this. Asked in a slightly different way, name, rank, and serial number, I got it, right? I understood.
Yeah.
Katelin, this is the quietest I've ever heard you, or not heard you.
I bit my tongue really hard and I can't speak.
Is it possible to have probationary periods with new employees?
Sure.
Is it possible to have a probationary period with new employees? So you mean
Like,
hire?
build it into the,
Do you want to hire that person?
yeah, so hire a person saying, hey, I'm hiring you,
On probation?
6 months from now.
You know, the problem
I'm
with
gonna
the
let you go,
probationary
for
period,
cost, right?
the problem with it though is you're mostly going to be an at-will employer, right? And probationary periods are, I mean, they're not ubiquitous, but they're pretty common. But at the same time, they are a little counterintuitive if you're truly an at-will employer. And I've seen them used to argue that oh, you ended up you've modified the contract so that it's not an at-will employment. And part of that is you wouldn't have a probationary period if it were truly an at-will employment.
Yeah. I do think a lot of companies, Google, for example, so I graduated college in the Bay Area the year before Google went public. And so some of us were fools and went to law school, and others of us went to Google pre-IPO. You tell me which one made the better decision. But at that point in time, and I think they still have this practice, every position is a temp to hire position. So you go in and you know, and half of my college roommates that went there did not end up with full-time positions, and half did. And so you go in, and I think that the reason that they do that is to try it out and to also make people put their best foot forward. You haven't gotten the job yet, you need to earn the job, right? And I think that's a really good way of assessing how hungry somebody is for the job. But you could do it in a way without stipulating a 6-month period. You know, you could do it in a way that we want to make sure that it's a good fit for the company, and so this is, you know, we provide you a certain full-time arrangement after, you know, when we're satisfied it works, so without implying a period of time, which might change that at-will status. Yeah?
So a lot of medical schools, they went to multiple mini interviews, is interviewing hypothetical scenarios, just to pretty much see how a person reacts spontaneously to scenario he never have experienced. Do you think there is a role for MMIs in the startup interview?
Yeah, so let me make sure I got a question. If somebody volunteers information, No.
Multiple mini interviews. You interview person like you're on an island and you have 3 books. Which books would you choose? A hypothetical scenario, something you would never experience. And supposedly it gives you insight into their like spontaneous thinking, kind of pierce the veil of pre-canned answers and pre-canned interviews, and it allows you to truly see what this person is, like what their thought process is.
Yeah.
So is there a role for MMIs, multiple mini interviews in the startup?
Yeah, people use those kind of questions regularly. There's nothing legally prohibited about using. So the question was, can you use kind of, give the scenarios. I've heard everything from, if you were a tree, what kind of tree are you and why? Or if you go to an island, what are you going to take with you? I think it does give you insight into somebody's line of thinking. There's nothing that says you can't do that from a legal basis.
It is related to what we talked about earlier about having allowing individuals the same opportunity to answer the same questions, and then you can play off of those. But you know, as you put it, as we were talking about it, that you level set for each of your potential applicants by going through that process.
In this day and age, when there's a focus on D&I efforts and diversity and inclusion and across the board, and recognizing that we all carry some implicit bias with us in some shape or form, having that standardized interview questionnaire really helps, level set for all potential applicants who are applying. Even if it's personality traits, right? Like the introvert versus the extrovert, allowing people the space to answer the same questions does level the playing field, and I think it's a good practice.
You know, so in residency, as we select our residents, it used to be sort of a free-for-all, and it was very common if you had a family, you know, you start a family with residency, you know, and that went away. And then recently, it's moved to a model, within our subspecialty, you have to ask them a standard set of questions. You have to answer, you know, everyone has to answer those questions. And you can't ask these questions.
Yeah.
I have to say, before that, I was more of his model. Like, I just need to figure out if they're a complete weirdo or not, you know. That was the only thing I valued in the interview. But now I feel like I can evaluate, I feel it's more fair, and I feel like there's a little bit more objectivity in evaluating one candidate for another. So it makes me feel good that that's also being practiced in the real world.
Yeah. Something that comes up often in my interviews, I'm oftentimes interviewing people who are working parents or may become working parents. And I oftentimes want to explain to them our flex time program and the flexibility and how you can do this. But I don't want it to be viewed as targeted to them because they are assuming that they're a caregiver, or that they would go reduce time because they're a working mother or whatever. And so I've developed my own internal dialogue that I use with people that our flex time program is available to all people, whether you want to go fly fishing on a more regular basis or whether you have family responsibilities that require some of your time at home, but kind of rehearsing how am I going to, because you want to sell the good things about your company. We offer great family leave. We offer great flex time. We have these other benefits. You just have to be careful about how you communicate it.
And Katelin, as you've done your interviews, do you have what approach do you take? Do you have a go-to set of questions?
I'm learning great tips and tricks through this whole day on a whole variety of issues. I think these panels have been so good. I love the standardized list. I think having questions within that list that tests what you're looking for in a variety of different ways is great. I did not know that laws can be specific to cities, so there's something there, justice. I'm learning a lot as we go. Do we have other questions before we start wrapping up?
Yeah, what about when I work for federal government, so NIH has on their HR pages the questions they ask for standard interviews. And then it's a big list, depending on the types of positions. And they have found that it's easier to get dialogues going. And what about doing that, you've got on your portal, here's some questions you can expect to do. Because it may show that they have also a deeper interest in your company, in that startup, because they've already visited different areas of that. I'm always trying to teach my students to investigate the company. So what are the thoughts on that?
Yes, the question was, is it a good idea to list interview questions on your company website to say these are questions that we will ask a subset of these in an interview? I can't say that I've had any clients that do that. I think it's a great idea because if somebody does go to your website, it will allow them to prepare, and if somebody is that interested in working for you, they will do their diligence and find those and prepare and show up for the interview in a different way because they're actually interested in working there. It wasn't just something that showed up on their LinkedIn profile as a possible fit. make sure your questions are carefully screened. I would avoid any of those pitfalls we were talking about. But yeah, I think it can also, I mean, I guess the downside would be those people that are really good salespeople and talkers get a little bit of a head start and can kind of prepare a dialogue that may not be fully truthful, right? So that would be the downside, but those people tend not to be the ones that do a ton of research and are really, really interested in the job and just want the job, you know?
And also, it seems to me that it depends on what you're testing for through the process. Are you looking for somebody that's important that they can think quickly and you know, and on their feet?
Yeah.
So,
well, like with the NIH, I mean, this is a big set of questionnaire, and they'll have a 45-minute interview, and they'll cherry pick, but if you go through, you know, all 52 questions, there are a lot of like critical thinking, kind of, you know, problem solving, kind of things. So
They could also help weed out the it's not worth my time to interview you because you're not the right fit, right? It could give people an idea of what your organization is about and what you're looking for and allow them to bow out before they start the process.
All right, this has been so helpful. I think one thing your cousin, who's a family law lawyer, help you set up your company, having had to recap a company with a license out of university. Ross, thank you for the help with all that. That was pretty screwed up. It took me over a year to get everything fixed. So you can spend a lot of time and money fixing everything later on, or you can do it right the first time. So we've been very fortunate to have a lot of human capital, intellectual capital here spending time with us today. Huge thank you to all of the Wilson folks for spending your day with us and giving us so much information. And also the Pivot Center. If you are a researcher, entrepreneur, community member, the Pivot Center is here to help you form a business plan, to give you the resources you need, to really be the nexus for our community between commercialization, between research, to really be that hub for innovation in the community. So you can find them, you can talk to Ross, you can talk to Keith, Paul. I'd be happy to connect you with those folks. You have the Wilson folks here. We're going to host a happy hour over at Altitude Labs. Well, Wilson's hosting it. I'm just here to point people in the right direction. But thank you for coming and spending the day with us. This has been a phenomenal group. And I think we've really all had a lot of lessons learned. We've recorded the content. So if you follow us at BioHive on our social media, you can also get the videos. Wilson has been such fantastic partners in also getting us access to the presentations today, which is a wonderful community service because this is incredible content. Again, I can't tell you the times I banged my head against the wall, having to just restructure a company. If I would have had a resource like Wilson Sonsini, my life would have been so much easier. So huge thank you to really all the folks that put this together, both Pivot Center and Wilson Sonsini. Thank you for coming together and doing this with us today.
Thanks for having us.
No, I didn't get everything. So, Altitude Lab, this is why we have Katelin wrap up. She does a great job. Thank you. And a great panel. Altitude Labs is